Cool. Well, we should be live. Let me know if you can hear me. Say hello in the chat. Looks like we've got a few people that were waiting, so we'll just see. Make sure everything's good. Should be all good. Just see if a couple more people drop in. Cool. All right, we'll make a start, I guess. So we're going to be building an RSS feed reader. We're mostly going to start with some architecture stuff, some database models and such. We'll write some tests along the way, of course. So I guess we'll get started. We'll spend most of today actually parsing some feeds. So we'll be using my blog as an example. So if you don't know, I have a blog, and my blog has an RSS feed in the form of an Atom feed that uses XML, which is fairly simple, to be fair. You get a title, you get a description, you get the last updated at, which in this case is 12:30, which will be the last timestamp of one of my posts. So we'll use this updated key to make sure we're not unnecessarily updating feeds. We'll pass out some of these entries. So each of these blog posts is an entry. It has a title. It has a link to the blog post. It has an ID as well, which we could use actually. This should technically be unique. Some author info, summary in the form of HTML, as well as an updated timestamp for that post. So, seeing as we've got this feed, why don't we jump straight into it? I've got a fairly blank Laravel app. I'm just going to install Pest to do all of our testing. And we can run phprs and pest install. And that will set up our testing folder. We'll use unit tests and we'll also use feature tests. So let's think about what we want to do. We'll start by creating a class, and we'll just call this feed reader. It's going to be a fairly simple class. That should do nicely. And we'll create a constructor. So we're going to have a protected string for the feed URL. And hey Shufaro, how's it going? I guess we should technically call that URL. And when we pass in that URL, we're going to want to call the read function. Yep, that looks good to me. So read is we'll come back to types later on. We'll start by making it a test. So this is going to be a unit test, and we'll just call this feed reader test. And our first test is going to be dead simple. It's going to be, it can be created. So this is just going to assert that we can instantiate the class, and we'll use my blog for all of the test cases here, since I know this isn't going to go anywhere. So if we run our tests, we should see, well, I haven't made any assertions, but we'll say expect feed reader to be an instance of feed reader. Now when we run our tests, you can see it can be created. It is true. Let's just tidy this up a little bit here. We'll remove the feature tests for now and just add a git keep file, and we'll remove that example test. So our feed reader can be created. That's a good start. We want to make sure that it can read the feed. So we'll call this reader. Let's make a little function in here just called reader that will just return an instance of feed reader, so that we don't have to keep on duplicating all of this code. Can actually just do this. So expect reader. So we'll call that reader. So we've got this read method. This can return void. Actually, it can return static. That's fine. So we'll just return this. This will allow us to chain methods on. I think the first step is we're going to want to get the contents of that URL. So we can make a new prop called string contents, and this can be nullable by default. Let's do this contents equals http get this URL, and we want to assign the body. We're also going to want a boolean to say whether we've loaded it. Actually, no, we don't. We can just check that contents isn't null. That's a fair way to do it. So we'll just say loaded. Return this contents is not equal to null, and we'll add this up here. So if this is loaded, we'll just return this early, so we can prevent multiple unnecessary reads of the same file in one instance. That's fine. So this contents is going to load the contents of this file, and we then need to parse the XML. So PHP has is it simple XML? Yeah. So PHP has an XML parser built in, which is good. We can use this. So simple XML load string presumably will return an element, perhaps, if we take a look at the definition. Yep, it returns simple XML element or false, meaning it could fail. Yeah, this function may return boolean false, which evaluates to false. Please read the section on booleans. That's fine. False on failure. And it also throws exceptions for errors in the XML data. Okay. That's fine. Okay, so instead of, let's change this around a little bit. Instead of storing the contents in a nullable property, let's instead store an instance of simple XML element. And we'll call this document. That's technically what it is going to be. And we'll just say this document equals well, we still need to retrieve that file. So we'll do this, and we'll get the body from the response, and then we can do this. Document equals simple XML load string, and it will be the response. Cool. So now our next test will be making sure that loaded. That will also need to be updated. So it can read the feed. So we'll expect reader read loaded to be true. Can't type. Let's run this test. A facade route has not been set. Yes, this does make sense. Since this is a unit test, by default it's going to be using the base PHP unit test case. So instead we need to say that this uses the test case inside of tests. So it technically becomes a feature test instead. But we're testing a single class, so we can get away with calling this a unit test, I think. Cool, so we can read the file. Loaded is returning true, which is good. That's because this is returning some data. Now if we dig into the simple XML API a little bit more, we can have a look. Get namespaces, count constructs, children. Okay. We can use XPaths as well to query elements, which could work. Yeah, this could work. If we have a look at the feed, what we really want to do is we don't really care about the title. Not right now anyway. We just care about all of these entries. So let's go ahead and start passing those out. I usually use Orchestral Parser for XML. Oh, interesting. Let's Orchestral Parser. Let's have a look. Let's have a look. So, provides a simple way to parse XML to array without having to write complex logic. Interesting. So, what do? Do you provide an array shape, meaning these are the keys that you want, and then this is how it finds the keys, I suppose. Interesting. It's got a Laravel service provider, which is cool. So double colons to access attributes, dots to access nested elements. This actually seems pretty solid. Why don't we use this? Cheers, George. Let's give this a go. So what do we get? We get XML parser load path to above XML. Does that support URLs? There's no documentation, it seems, so we'll have to dig in. It will be reader, I assume. No. Document. Nope. Facade. remote. You're welcome. It works with URLs. Sweet. Okay, so we can just call load. I imagine load is doing some checks to see if it is a URL or not. In which case, this makes our lives a lot easier. So we can still do this stuff, but we don't need to make that request there. Instead, we will have a look back at the docs. Let's close that. So, I don't like it when facades are called facade because it conflicts with. It feels like I'd have to alias the import, which just feels weird. Document extends base document. Oh, so it's built on another library here. It just has Laravel bindings by the looks of it. Okay, let's get rid of that and let's use that facade. I might need to index my workspace. There we go. So we'll use this as XML with the proper casing. Let's remove the type there for now. So this is going to be XML load. Perhaps not. So these methods aren't marked as static in the doc block, so it thinks I'm having to call them on an instance. That should say @method static. I suppose we could contribute to this package real quick. Let's do that. I'll just clone it inside of this repository for now. That is fine. So let's run a composer install. We'll just comment this out for now. So we've got parser, facade, and we will call this fix facade doc blocks. I spelled doc blocks wrong. It would help if I got my keyboard shortcuts right as well. So that should say static. That should also say static. Let's just double check. Yeah, we bind an instance of reader to that binding. What is XML reader? It's this here, isn't it? Yeah. Cool. So, I mean, just to make sure that everything is working, we've got a script in here to run tests. No. We'll just run PHP unit. All the tests are passing. We'll just say fix non-static doc blocks or doc blocks not declaring facade methods static. Sweet. Pull request. Why don't search packages for an RSS parser? Well, I am. I'm using another package now. Noticed that the doc blocks on the facade weren't marked as static, so IntelliSense cool. That shouldn't be a problematic PR. For now, we can carry on. We'll just delete that folder. So we know that we need to load it, and just for now, we'll just DD this document. This is going to mess up RSS. Let's run our tests just to see what we get. Let's just get the type. So it is a document. Nice. So this is going to be one of those. Sweet. Cool. Thanks for that suggestion, George. That should save some time. Our tests are still passing. Okay, so what we want now is a way to, let's take a look at the document. I need to re-index my workspace as well. What methods do we have here? So we saw that we had that pass method earlier. Yeah, see this is having a go at me because it can see that the method exists. It just knows that it's not static. Okay. So let's write a method that returns all of the entries. And I suppose the way we can do this is if we bring the docs back up, we can use this pass method to pull back all of the info about an entry, and then we'll create a DTO for that as well. So we've got support, and let's just write a constructor. So what info do we want from our RSS feed? We want the title, we want the ID, which in this case is the link, we want the summary and the updated as well. We won't really care about the author right now, but yeah, let's do that. Let's get title, link, summary. So we'll have title, summary, and updated is going to be a timestamp, so we can convert that to a Carbon instance. Yeah, awesome. So we'll get the entries by calling this document pass. Title is going to be there, and that will be, is it uses? Yep. So uses entry.title, and then we want the link. So this uses entry.link, and then we want the summary. So again, this uses entry.summary, and the updated is going to use entry.updated. So let's just dd entries. Does this return an array? So we'll just dd the first one, and reader yeah, let's just do this. Let's run our test and see what we get. Undefined array key 0. Let's dd entries. Interesting. So we only get one at a time. Do we need to... Let's read up on the documentation for the parent package, which is Laravel Parser. So I wonder if parser, is there no docs? Is there a wiki? No. How do we specify that we want to retrieve multiple of these? Do we have to like wrap this in an array as well? Nope. Any ideas? Let's have a look. So document pass. XML document, there we go. Supports multi-level. Perhaps it is inside of here. Definitions, multi-level, uses, that's not what we want. So maybe, what happens if you get 2 entries? Let's just do a bit of debugging here. It still uses the last one. This isn't super clear to me. Config? There's a config method. Ignore, no. So it looks like it only supports 1. Okay, let's try this. Why don't we do just why don't we do uses entry instead? What does this give us? It gives us loads of line breaks. Okay. And what if entry is an array that uses this? Yeah, starting to think I should have just stuck with simple XML. This isn't immediately clear how it works. Tests. Let's have a look at the tests. Okay, so it does work. So you would have to say you want users. I went down this spiral and ended up using 6 something. Yeah, it does seem a bit easier now that I'm looking at this. So it does work. Digging into the tests. Let's try this. So entries is going to be, we want entries, and that's going to be an array that uses, is it another array or is it a string? No, it's just a string, so it'll be entry. And we wanted title, link, summary, and updated. So let's DD entries. Aha, here we go. So we've got 56 items in the array. Interesting. Yeah, I mean, the lack of documentation is a bit of a pain there. I had to dig into the source for it, but it is what it is. So entries is an array, so we actually want to return, we're going to use a collection because we're in Laravel, so we can. So this is going to be instance of collection. We'll return collect entries, and we'll map over only. All right, no, we want to collect the entries and map over each of those. So we can do this with a short closure. So we get an entry which is an array, and we can just return a new feed entry, spreading out the array. And that test is going to fail because it expects that to be a Carbon instance, which it is not. It also looks like we've got the link tag missing as well. Let's just DD entries real quick. Link is null. Link rel alternate. Why won't that pick up the link tag? I suppose we can just use the ID. Let's take a look at Freek's feed, if he has one. Does he have a feed? Let's have a look. Feed.xml. RSS. No. Feed. Here we go. So he's got an ID as well. Although that seems to be okay. It does take you to the right place. It just doesn't have a nice URL, does it? Like these. Link href link. Oh, of course, yeah. I want the value of an attribute, don't I? You are correct. Thank you again, George. Yeah, I want the value of the href attribute. Yeah. So I have to say link like that, and it's going to seem a bit weird, but let's do this and have updated be Carbon pass entry updated. Let's run our tests, and they all pass. Sweet. Okay, so this feels very JavaScripty, like hacky almost. But we've got named args as well, so the keys here can be used for the arguments here. Awesome. Cool. We can assert that each item is also an instance of feed entry, which it is. Sweet. Okay. So we've got a basic feed reader. Pretty handy. We've written some very basic tests. Like those tests aren't great, but I suppose we could technically assert against each of the properties as well. Is this going to be a product for reading multiple feeds? I'm just building an app. You know, it might go somewhere. It will be open source, so if you wanted to use it yourself, you could. Someone suggested it to me on Twitter, so here we are. Cool. Let's make some models, I guess. So we'll make a new model called feed. And this model is going to have a string name. It's also going to have a URL, which should be unique because we don't want to create multiple feeds with the same URL. Table timestamps. We could use the updated at, but I'm actually going to do last processed at, and that will be nullable. And I think for now that is fine. I haven't even got a database. So let's create an SQLite database. And migrate. Sweet. Cool. So let's update our model. It's going to be unguarded. And it will have a cast for the last processed at timestamp to be a date time. And let's add a process method. So the process method is going to essentially create it's gonna read the feed. So we'll create a new feed reader with this URL. We also want to read in that reader. This could probably be done separately. Let's create a public static function make with a string URL, static return new static URL. So this will just make chaining a little bit nicer. So we'll read that in and we'll load all of the entries. Although we technically only want to do this if the feed itself has an updated greater than our posts. Greater than our posts last processed at timestamp. Okay. Feeder, that's wrong. Reader. So instead, why don't we get our, we'll say last or updated. This can return an instance of carbon. And we just want to fetch the top level updated. Is that going to work? Let's just DD the result of this. and call, where are we? Let's call updated. Let's also make a test. So this will be a feature test. We'll put this in models feed. That should be called feed test. There we go. Apologies if you can hear someone doing donuts outside in a car for whatever reason. So we'll check that it can be processed. And we'll set the name to foo. The URL will be my blog. And this isn't the safest way to test, but I know right now that my blog feed's not going anywhere. URL and last process stat will be null. Let's just call feed process and run our tests. 0 updated. Yeah, so it doesn't seem that we can just get a single, does that only accept an array? Yeah. Config ignore, if not ignore, output key. I don't see why you'd want to ignore. Seems kind of odd. Okay, so we'll just say this user is updated. And now we get that timestamp, which is good. So we'll call that results and we'll return carbon pass results updated. So in our feed, we'll say if reader updated is after the last processed at timestamp, or is before, then we can return. This is going to return void. So we don't want to process this feed again if the last processed at is after the most recent or the updated at timestamp. Yep, that seems right. We can test that as well. So let's just do that. Process. Should probably return a boolean from that method actually instead of void to indicate success. So we can return false. So it can be processed. Let's just take this to be true. And now that's going to fail because we're not returning. If we test that now, failed asserting that false is true. Correct. So let's just do sub years 10 just to make sure it is in the past. Cool. So it can, it will not be processed if feed is older than most recent processed timestamp. That is an awful test name, but it will make sense. So we'll set now to add a year, so it's always in the future. And we can expect process to be false. How about that? So we've got a feed. We also want to store those entries somewhere. So we've got our feed entry DTO, which we could probably call something else, or we create a new entry model instead. So we're going to have an entry model, and we'll create an entries table. And this will have a UUID. So I've got a package for that. So on our entry model, we can use has UUID, which I need to import. We'll make this unguarded as well. So UUIDs have to be unique. This is also going to belong to a feed. So feed ID constrained, and we'll cascade on delete. There is a possibility that we would need to figure out when this was last updated. Yeah, so we've got our feed ID. Or I guess any time we process a feed, we could filter. This is going to be tough. We'll write super unoptimized code right now. You know, this isn't going to be designed to scale hugely. It'll just be for personal use. So table timestamp. No, table. 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 Yeah, okay. Let's just add a string for entry ID. No, string feed entry ID. And that will also have to be unique or nullable. No, that's fine. So a feed has many entries. And an entry belongs to a feed. Essentially what we want to do is when we process the feed, we want to loop over each of the entries and update or create a entry based on the feed entry. So as well as the title, we're also going to want the ID. So over in our reader, when we get all those entries, we can get the ID. And we'll just run our tests. All passing, good. Feed, entry, feed, entry. So we're going to want some extra columns in our entries table. So we'll have a string for title, summary, which will be nullable. Table string. Oh, we've got the feed entry ID there. What else did we have? Title, link. Link is important. Yep. So in our feed, we can get all of the entries, and for each of those feed entries, we can say this entries update or create based on the feed entry ID, which is going to be entry ID. We will update the title with the entry title the summary with that summary, and the link with the link. Yeah, we'll leave the updated at for now. Let's just run our tests. Something fails in the way. Entries.feed ID not null. Insert into entries. Feed entry ID. Feed ID. Title. Values. Question mark. Okay. What's going wrong here then? Did I set up the relationship correctly? Entries has many entry. It's going to be that. Interesting. What's going wrong here? Update or create. This entries update or create has many. Feed entry ID. So this is on has one or many. Fill with the values. Instance save first or new. If is null instance this where. It should be working unless I'm doing something awfully wrong. Title, summary link, reader entries each, feed entry, this entries. This is going to be the current feed. Ah, I know exactly what it is. In my feed test, I'm doing new feed. I'm not actually creating a feed in the database. So we'll manually create one instead. And that's fine. So now if we test, it passes. And so we can expect feed to be true. We can also expect feed entries count to not be, or to not to be 0. Unique constraint fails, that is fine. So in here, we're not testing on an in-memory database, which we should be. So if we just migrate fresh, and in our test case, we can use lazily refresh database. Run our tests again. And it all seems to work. And to make sure that things are actually being created in the correct way, why don't we also create a reader or a new make for my blog. So let's read that in. And then after we've processed, we can expect feed entries first. Let's actually do this after we've created them. So we can get our reader, we can get our entries and get the first entry. We can expect the title for that entry to be equal to that entry's title, as well as the summary, and the feed entry ID to also be the same as the entry ID. And that all seems to pass. Wicked. So we've got feeds, we've got entries, we've got a basic feed reader, and some tests to accompany those. So feature, basic feeds and entries. And since the scale of this app is going to be fairly small, we'll actually use a scheduled job. A scheduled command, sorry. So we'll say process feeds. And that should really be called process feeds command. So let's do that. Command. And I like to do cron process feeds. So, you know, prefixing your commands like this just makes it clear where it's being executed. So you might have script colon, which will be like scripts that you run yourself manually. You have cron, in this case it's going to be run on the scheduler. So protected description, process, all created feeds. So we don't need a constructor. What we can do though is do feed lazy each. And for now, we will just run this in the terminal. And we'll also, just in Tinkerwell, we can create a feed. So name, just call it foo. URL is going to be pretty much that. Cool. So now if we rerun this, we should see our feed pop up. And instead of doing this in a single process on the cron, which could potentially hold it up, why don't we just dispatch feed process? Yeah, we'll just dispatch a closure. And we'll explicitly import feed here instead, like so. Or for testing's sake, let's make a job, and we'll just call this process feed. It will receive a private feed, and in here just do this feed process. You know, there's no error handling or anything right now, but that's something that we can work on. And then in our command, instead of dispatching a closure, we can do process feed. And if we run that, that will dispatch it to the queue. We can make a test for this as well. So a pest test commands. It was process feed, plural commands. And again, that should be called process feeds command test. We'll say it correctly dispatches process feed jobs for each feed. So we'll have to create a feed. Like so. We'll fake the queue. will oh boy, how do you test artisan commands again? Console tests. Pretty sure you can just call this artisan. Is there a way of doing that nicely with pest? That is the question. Because I'd expect artisan to be a function. So you have okay, yeah, I didn't install the Laravel plugin, did I? Pest plugin Laravel. It is. So if I index my workspace, we'll just go to the docs. So Laravel, available functions. Yeah, I mean, it should just work, right? If I say artisan string command, process feeds command. Assert successful. Assert pushed. And we can just say that a process feed class was pushed, and if we run this test, it passes. Sweet. So let's commit that. Feature process feeds command. And while we're here, we'll just set this up on the scheduler. So schedule command process feeds command. And let's just do this every 30 minutes. Or we'll say every or hourly. And that is now registered with the scheduler. So if I were to, is it test? So we could test that. It runs it. And just to make it a little bit prettier, why don't we do some output? So we'll say this info dispatching processor for feed get key. And now if we test it, Acron process feeds, you can see we've got the output there. And we can update our test as well, so expect output to contain dispatching processor for feed, and we can get the key for this, run our tests, and they're still passing. So add output to command, and I think we'll call it a day. So thank you guys for tuning in. We created a small wrapper around a XML parser library, and we're passing the document into some DTOs. So we've just got this feed entry here. We then use that to process a feed model and store each of those entries against the feed inside of an entry model. And that's all being done via a scheduled command, which just dispatches a process feed job for every single feed that we've got registered. Thank you guys for tuning in. I'll probably carry on with this at some point, not sure when, but I'll leave a link in the description to the repository. Yeah, Thank you for tuning in, and enjoy the rest of your weekend.